Well, hello, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're viewing us on YouTube, thanks for being here with us today. Can't wait for another great day on Faithful Politics. I'm your ever faithful host, Josh Bertram, and we have our ever political host, Will. Will, how are you?
Living the dream, thanks.
Good. Me too. And today we get the distinct pleasure of interviewing Thomas C. Berg, who is the James L. Overstar Professor of Law and Public Policy at University of St. Thomas. Sorry, it took me a minute to get that out. He's had his Juris Doctorate from the University of Chicago Law School, an MA in Religion from the University of Chicago, and also a Master's of Arts in Philosophy and Politics from Oxford University, and had his Bachelor of Science from Northwestern University. He's an expert in church and state, things constitutional law and free speech, intellectual property, and religious liberty, right to life issues, and abortion and school choice. So he is like the perfect person to have on the show, because you're like an expert in all the things that like really fuse politics and religion. And we're just so thankful for you to be on the show with us today.
It's great to be here. Nice to talk with you.
So is Tom okay? I should have asked before we started recording.
Tom is great. Tom is better than Thomas.
Very good. Well,
I
Tom,
want my name
so
to be as short as possible. Right? So if Berg, Tom, that's pretty short. So that's good.
I get that. Well, Tom, thanks so much for being on the show with us today. We can't wait to have this conversation. I know I've been looking forward to it since the moment I laid eyes upon your book and saw this wonderful book with a beautiful cover. Can you lift it up, Will? I forgot my copy downstairs in my home, and there it is, Religious Liberty in a Polarized Age. We're going to talk about that today and much more. So, Tom, thanks so much for being here. Hey, so you have a very special status as a lawyer, and we wanted you to bring that out in this case. So, I mean, in this episode, so people can kind of understand, get more of an idea of where you're coming at in this book. So, what didn't you have something to do with the Obergefell case?
So the book is kind of an extended argument for protecting religious liberty in some of the most controversial cases that we have, and also some like not really controversial cases, but protect it strongly, but also protect other important rights sometimes in conflict with religious objections, including same-sex marriage rights, LGBTQ rights generally. And these are hard things to work out in terms of protecting both, but I think it can be done. But the main thing is that we're trying to protect both. So the example that I give of that, like my little brag, is think of two cases that in the Supreme Court: the big Obergefell case on same-sex marriage, and second, the cake designer case, Jack Phillips of Masterpiece Cake Shop a few years ago. There are 3 lawyers in the country who filed friend of the court briefs in both of those cases supporting the same-sex couples and Jack Phillips, like 3 lawyers in the entire country, and I'm one of them. So it's just not a common thing to argue for both of these claims, and that, it seems to me, is an indicator of, maybe it's an indicator that I'm out to lunch here. There's hardly anyone takes that position, but I think it's an indicator that we don't have enough sympathy cutting across ideological lines, and that's part of the focus of the book.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's what interested me so much about your book, Tom, because I do think religious liberty is so crucial and so core. I would even call it probably among the rights we have, if not the top 3 rights that we have to be able to worship and live life according to our most deeply held beliefs. And your book argues about religious liberty, and if I understood it correctly, it was almost like could be a cure for political division. What can you elaborate on that and kind of help us understand it feels like religious liberty is a super contentious issue. It just feels like people just fight about it all the time, and religions just get so angry at each other. Or maybe people feel that way. What's going on
Yeah.
here? Kind of elaborate on that.
So I might not go so far as a cure, but a medicine that might reduce the symptoms of our
Like an
polarization
aspirin.
problem. An aspirin, right? Maybe you still got the disease, but it doesn't cause quite as disabling a set of symptoms.
Nice.
And I think that is absolutely right that religious liberty can serve that goal. So let me just explain that, and then I'll take the qualifier, which is what kind of religious liberty are we talking about in order to achieve that? Um, it's fairly clear when you look at the social science on polarization. There's been a lot written about that in the last few years by political scientists and sociologists and so on, that we are stuck in these cycles of fear of the other side, and of what the other side is going to do to our side if they get power, and resentment about what the other side is going to do to our side, and therefore a need to get power ourselves and retaliate against the other side for what they've done, or better yet, before they get a chance to do it, knock them down. That dynamic is just, very is pervasive, I think. Uh, it's a to me it is a softer, kind of less severe version of the dynamic that gave rise to religious liberty in the West in the first place, which is the Reformation era fights between Protestants and Catholics in Europe, and within different Protestant groups, that then came over to America with the English colonists and other colonists, and the solution to those cycles of violence there. Well, I mean, let's take an example of a cycle of violence. In our law school, we're a Catholic law school. We have a statue of St. Thomas More in the big atrium of our law school. Beautiful white colored statue, and he is, of course, the patron saint for Catholics of lawyers and statesmen, and also known for his standing up for conscience. And the church venerates him as a kind of spokesman for the right of conscience. You read A Man for All Seasons, or ever seen the film. That's Thomas More speaking out for the right of conscience. But Thomas More, before he was on the bad side of Henry VIII, was Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, and he went after Protestants, and delivered them over to the civil authorities, or to be hanged or burned, and was very energetic at it. So it was, back and forth. And this is not particularly a cut on Thomas More. That was the way things were then, and he thought that Protestants were going to tear down everything that existed in England. And then, of course, the other side thought that about him. And the answer to that was religious liberty over time. Take the government out of suppressing people's faith, leave room for people to live their not only believe, not only gather in small insular settings, but to live out their faith in public, as long as they don't violate the rights of others. And we have to decide what the rights of others are, and much of the book is about that. But that's the American response was to pick up on that solution, at least a partial solution to religious conflict, and enshrine it in the Constitution, and eventually in our traditions. And I think with careful thought, it can play that role again today in our conflicts today.
Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on, when thinking about sort of the broader American context about religious liberty, like what do you think most Americans get right and get wrong about the concept of religious liberty?
Well, I think part of the issue here is that we've got, when we describe polarization, we've got groups on the two sides whose interest it is in not hearing the other side and in fomenting conflict, right? That's what stirs up, whether it's likes or fundraising or whatever it is. I think most Americans in the what was once called the vital center appreciate the importance of religious liberty for all faiths. They appreciate it for Christians, for conservative Christians, for liberal Christians. They appreciate it for Jews, American Jews, whether they're Reform or Orthodox. They appreciate it for Muslims as well. And the problem comes with sort of those on the two sides who are kind of locked in and kind of benefit from the polarization. The book is about is an argument. It kind of let's put together the arguments and the case for thinking about it in this way that can bring people together in the center.
Yeah, because whenever I excuse me, whenever I hear the term religious liberty or religious freedom, it's always in the context of like Christians being persecuted for one thing or another. So it's like, you can't tell my church that we have to close down for COVID because you're interfering, but yet you have all these other churches of these different denominations that aren't necessarily raising as loud of a fuss
Right.
about that.
Right.
So I'm curious, like how did religious liberty get I don't know, co-opted by Christians, because we do live in a religious pluralistic country.
Yeah, religious liberty has a significant branding problem right now, right? Like, and the I think that's at the center of what I'm dealing with in the book. And I'd say so. In order for religious liberty to not be this divisive thing that is wielded by, well, in this, let's say, to the extent conservative Christians have done this, and I think they clearly have, wielded it only as a protection for them. And for example, we've got way too many examples of suppressing Muslim religious freedom led by evangelicals. The opposition to building mosques, that is led around the country by white evangelical preachers. This is not good. This is not religious freedom, right? And the Trump travel ban on people from Muslim-dominated nations, the highest support for that was among white evangelicals. So these are real problems. But I don't think the answer is to reclaim religious liberty. But that doesn't mean that conservative Christians shouldn't be protected as well. And that the tendency is to, for folks on the left, is to jump over to the other side and think that conservative Christians, because they exercise power in some places and in some settings, which they do, they overlook that they're a vulnerable minority in other places. Conservative Christians are subject to discrimination in public universities. They're subject to impositions in blue states and so on. So we've got to see that in this complex patchwork of power in the United States, different groups can be the minority at different places, and we need to protect all of them. So, very, very quickly, religious liberty is only going to work as a means of, let's say, reducing polarization, not eliminating, but reducing it. If it's strong, it's got to be strong enough to protect people and give them the real security against fear. It's got to be equal. And it's got to be truly equal, because otherwise it's just a way of advancing your side. And it also has to take account of the limits on religious freedom. There are limits in the COVID context. There are limits in the non-discrimination context. We have to work those through, but we've got to protect religious liberty strongly in doing that. The devil's in the details on that. We can talk about some of those specific situations.
Of course, yeah, the devil is in the details. And one interesting analogy that you draw out in your book is two strange, almost polar opposite groups in some ways, conservative Christians and same-sex couples. And you talk about them in this analogy, meaning there's enough similarities that maybe both conservative Christians and same-sex couples should think about, the other side more because of what they share potentially. But talk about that a little bit. Why are they so closely related when they seem so far apart?
Yeah, I mean, it's surely in terms of like the kind of the vision of the good life that conservative Christians have versus same-sex couples, there are major differences there. Conservative Christians understand the Bible to forbid same-sex relationships and so on as part of a vision of sexuality, and obviously that's very different from what same-sex couples live and believe. I'm talking, though, about the way in which the 2 points of view and the 2 beliefs and identities operate in the lives of those who live them. And the similarities are, you can run through it. In both cases, we're talking about a feature and identity that is pervasive in the person's life. Your faith is pervasive in your life. It affects your family. It affects your education. It affects the service you give to others. You want to live consistently with it in all aspects of your life. Being married to a partner, having a relationship with a partner, same-sex partner, as well as the opposite sex, is a pervasive aspect of life. It's the integration of love and care and commitment and intimacy, and that's pervasive too. And it's not just an identity. It's not just you can be gay. You live. You're in a relationship.
Yeah.
You act. But you're not just a Christian. Like it's okay. You be a Christian. You've got to live it, right? And it's just as wrong to just simply pretend that the answer is you can have that faith, but you can't act on it. You can have that orientation, but that's different from acting on it. And both things get said to the other side. And then the third thing is, well, maybe a third thing that the pushback that people give. Well, you can do this, but keep it in a narrow part of life.
Right.
Worship in the church, worship in the synagogue, etc. But take it out into your social services and the workplace, and then there can't be, there have to be severe limits on that. You can't really take it into those areas. That's a very constricted view of religious freedom, because people, again, the pervasive nature of faith is that people need to be able to live it in their lives. But same thing for same-sex couples. The claim is not just to be in the closet. The claim is to be able to live in civil society and in civil marriage. So that's the parallels. If we could just have some sympathy for the claims that the other side is making.
Just real quick, Tom, I love what you said, but I've heard people say, I hear people say a lot, I don't care what you do in your bedroom. Do whatever you want in your bedroom, but once you've pushed it on me, now I've got a problem. So I'm not claiming that's right or wrong. I'm hearing you say that kind of thing isn't helpful. It doesn't help when we are trying to restrict someone's identity to certain circumstances. But anyway, we can get back onto that. I know Will had a question.
Yeah, I'm curious on your thoughts about, the separation of church and state. So, our audience knows, this was sort of like a line. Thomas Jefferson wrote Danbury Baptist. And there have been arguments on both sides claiming to kind of, define what that means. So one camp is, the wall is a wall, it's impenetrable. You can't jump back and forth. So no church and state, no state and church. Then there's another side that says, well, the intent of it, was specifically for the state to stay out of the church's business. So I'm curious if you can kind of give us your thoughts on what that means, and maybe just kind of better define it for us.
Sure. Um, yeah, it has to run both ways, to an extent. The state is, I guess the way I'd refocus it is that separation of church and state is primarily about what we tell the state to do and not to do, right? The state should not be involved. But that means the state should not be involved in religion, either in promoting it, pushing it on people, or in interfering with it. And that means we want to think about, for example, the kind of cases that we fight about. We fight a lot about state imposition on religious organizations, and I think that religious organizations should be strongly protected under a notion of separation. And one big part of church-state separation is protection of the church against the state. But the side that the Supreme Court right now is not taking seriously in separation, or at least is moving towards minimizing, is the government getting involved in pushing religion on people. You've got the these are not the most serious impositions probably, but the Supreme Court is pretty much ready to say that religious symbols adopted by the government as official symbols are okay, because historically those have been allowed, and that to me takes us in the direction of it's likely to be the majoritarian faith that's imposed. We got Texas, for example, considering a bill to require the Ten Commandments posted in every classroom in the public schools. That would not move us in the direction of religious freedom. It would be a kind of freedom, you might say, for Christians to, get that adopted by the government. That's a sort of freedom, but that's not the kind of freedom that can be sustainable for everyone. The kind of freedom that's sustainable for everyone is for the government to stay out of it. And so I'm pretty supportive of what the Supreme Court is doing, mostly on the free exercise of religion, but not very supportive of the direction it's starting to head on the Establishment Clause.
So, right, and that's very important for us as Americans to remember, that there's two sides of religious freedom, right? There won't be an established church, which means the government's not going to push religion on you, and you're going to have freedom to exercise your religion, which means the government's not going to prevent you from exercising your religion. And I do agree that amongst my conservative friends, it seems like they're super excited about being protected. They're not as okay as everyone else getting the same protections. And they wouldn't say it like that because I don't think they're thinking in those terms. But something like the Ten Commandments, it's so natural to just think, oh, well, it's the Ten Commandments. Why wouldn't you put up there? What's wrong with that? Well, maybe, 5, starting with 5, it's pretty universal in some sense of the rules and stuff like that. But the first 4 all have to do with worship of Yahweh. So it's interesting to see these things being played out and being argued on the public stage, on the legal stage, and even in the private stage at dinners and at parties and get-togethers and things like that, as people talk about this. It makes me think of the Constitution because all of this comes down right to a Constitution. I excuse me. I'm a pastor. I'm pursuing a doctorate. I really love research. I love understanding the Bible. I love looking at it in its original language. And so, right, the Constitution was written in an older English, but that idea that lawyers come to it and they try to interpret and judges interpret the Constitution, right? And we still interpret the Constitution. We either interpret it in a conservative way or in the way that we have to figure out what they thought at that time, original intent, or we interpret it in another way that it's a living document. My sense is that it's somewhere in the middle. What do you think about that? Is the Constitution, how effective is it at protecting our religious liberty, and is it basically ready for the task in the future? Is it up for the task? Do you think the Constitution has what it takes to ensure religious liberty in this technological age and moving forward?
I think it does, to the extent that the threats to religious liberty come from the government. Because the Constitution is about the government, right? It is Congress shall make no law. And then that's extended to the states through the 14th Amendment, the so-called incorporation doctrine, where the Bill of Rights is incorporated to restrict states. Separate question whether private impositions on religious liberty by large businesses, etc., those kinds of things, that's a tougher question. It's the kind of question we're dealing with in freedom of speech questions about Facebook's control of. Well, I got us off on that, but I mean I think for the most part those things have to be dealt with by legislation, because the Constitution doesn't usually restrict private action. So you need legislation, but legislation informed by the same values of open debate, of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom to live according to your beliefs. Those can be taken over and applied in the private sphere. So one of the hopeful examples of protecting both sides that we've seen was a few years ago in Utah. Deep red state of Utah passed a statute that adopted sexual orientation as a protected category in employment and housing and a couple of other important areas, with strong protections for religious freedom, including not just against the government, but there's a provision in that Utah law that says that your position on marriage, whether it should be man and woman only or same-sex couples as well, that should not be the basis for firing you from a private employer as well. You should be able to hold those beliefs and not, be punished for them by a private employer as well. That's a really important benefit, and it came, actually, they were able to put it in the law because the two sides were willing to work together. And once you're able to legislate, then you can reach private conduct and try to come up with good balances there as well. So legislation is what you have to do in the area of private restrictions. But Josh, as far as the Constitution and government, the challenge of constitutional law and interpreting the Constitution is to take these principles that are embodied in the text, that reflect a value judgment in the text, and keep faithful to them today. That is there's a real kind of question there about what's the original value, and then how have things changed today and maybe require something that they didn't expect back then. So I think that happens on both clauses. So for example, maybe they thought in 1791 that the only thing that we were really worried about in an establishment was picking one Protestant denomination over another, picking the Anglicans over the Presbyterians, and picking the
obviously
but when we're more pluralistic, then the same value applies to favoring Christianity over Islam in an official way, favoring, you know, whatever, a broader kind of prohibition. But it works on the free exercise of religion side too. Much of our debates today are about whether there should ever be an exemption from the law for the religious believer, the religious claimant, like Jack Phillips or like Catholic adoption agencies or whatever. And there are people who point back to the original period and say they didn't expect that there would be many exemptions. So exemptions are not valid because the framers didn't expect that there would be many of them. They didn't talk much about it or whatever. But, you know, things are different today than they were in 1789 on that score too. We have way more laws than we did in 1789. Many more ways in which legislation can conflict with religious practices and religious conscience. And so you've got to have that room to have the protection for the religious believer in the particular case if you're going to apply the value of 1789 to today. So it's that, you know, being faithful to what originally was, but also taking account of how things are different.
Yeah, you know, speaking of things that are different, you know, when Brown v. Board of Education was decided, there was quite a bit of backlash, specifically from the religious right. And, you know, in particular, when the government was trying to strip the non-exempt or the tax status away from Bob Jones University because they were like a private you know, Christian school, and they're just like, yeah, we're not going to do it. And they're like, okay, well, you're going to start paying taxes. And I'm oversimplifying this, obviously, but it drove a lot of the religious right to the polls and kind of gave them like a mission, you know, like we need to do what we can to keep them out of our, you know, churches, out of our Christian schools, yada yada, what have you. And I'm curious if you see any parallels between that and sort of the rise of the religious right in today, you know, over a variety of different issues, whether it's gay marriage, vaccinations, you know, closures, mass, whatever. So like, are there parallels there that you see?
Yes, there are parallels, although I think that doesn't mean that we have to treat the two issues exactly the same. Mm-hmm. So there's no doubt that part of the rise of the religious right in the 1980s, we couldn't deny this, was a reaction against efforts to go after racially discriminatory schools. I think things like abortion and school prayer also did play a role. I think it would be too simplistic to just chalk it all up to racism. So just to say that, but I wouldn't deny that was part of it. You know, so here's the situation now. You've got a similar situation where whenever there is progress or movement on some issue, it does create a backlash, call it, or a push the other way, resistance. You know, what the question is, what are we going to do about that resistance? And in the area of racial discrimination as a society, we came to the conclusion through multiple legislation, through constitutional decisions, through constitutional amendments as well, that racial discrimination was so pervasive and harmful and, in a sense, really, you know, get to that image of America's original sin, that we needed to take a very hard line against resistance to racial discrimination. It took a while after Brown versus Board, but we eventually took a very hard line. And that has meant no religious exemptions, like, in the Bob Jones case. No right to a tax exemption if you are racially discriminatory. Um, Part of what has made evangelicals fearful in the last 10 years or so is the prospect that their views on marriage will be treated exactly the same as racism. Uh, in the Supreme Court in 2015, the U.S. Solicitor General in the Obama administration was asked that question, whether same-sex marriage is going to mean that religious schools with conservative views on marriage are going to be treated the same as racist schools in Bob Jones. And his answer was, yeah, that's going to be an issue, Justice. Yeah, that's going to be an issue. Okay. Josh, I don't know if you remember from 2016, that answer got
I
a lot of
absolutely
play.
remember.
So that's where the fears are real. And when people on the left talk in sort of very unqualified terms about bigotry, conservative views of marriage as bigotry, and equating it with racism, people, conservatives see, well, I see where this truck is headed, right? I don't think that we have to treat them exactly the same. We should take discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity seriously, and we should have laws against it. And part of what I'm arguing for is laws, but should there be exemptions to those laws? The answer is yes. I think the historical uniqueness of racial discrimination, its pervasiveness, is one reason. We don't have to necessarily reproduce that completely no exemptions position for all other forms of discrimination. And second, again, I'd go back to that parallel that I was talking about. The way in which the claims of same-sex couples involve this kind of combination of identity and conduct out in public that is also there for the religious believer. There's a parallel, and that suggests we ought to try to protect both. If you're talking about racial discrimination, discriminating against somebody based on their race is simply, that's just a feature about them. That's not this kind of mixture of identity and conduct. It's just a feature that people don't have control over. And so it's not quite parallel. And I think the parallels between the two, if you buy the analogy I'm arguing, is a reason to try to protect both. So yeah, that's I guess that's what I'd say about that, and that's what the book says about that.
Yeah, and I'm curious because when we had Amanda Tyler from the BJC on after the Kennedy v. Bremerton ruling, and one of her biggest concerns, and I've addressed this with other people that we've had on, but I'd really love to get your take, is, she was convinced that after that ruling that the lemon test was going to be thrown out the door, and it's been somewhat of a precedent, and maybe you can kind of just summarize what the lemon test is for our audience, but like with the absence of the lemon test, like, how will we know if the government has gone too far with regards to like religious liberty, or and maybe the follow-up question is like, what do we use, or maybe more importantly, what does the Supreme Court use now as kind of the litmus test if the lemon test is gone?
Yeah, so the lemon test, if we can try to translate, this is a gross oversimplification, into something that we can actually get our hands on. The fundamental question here is, does the government violate the Establishment Clause by taking a position on a religious matter and advancing it and promoting it, even if it doesn't do so coercively, even if it doesn't pressure people or require them to agree or require them to participate? So is it about only coercion, or does the Establishment Clause protect more broadly what are often called endorsements of a particular religious view? And what's happened in the Kennedy case and others is it looks like the court is moving more and more towards saying that endorsement of religion or a particular religious view is not a problem. It's only coercion. that is the violation, and that is, I think a legitimate source of worry for what that's going to mean in terms of protection of religious minorities and the climate for religious minorities. Uh, and so that's one aspect of it, and it's not a good development. Even if we assume that coercion of people, that actual pressure on them, and maybe everybody agrees that that's improper. I think folks both on the left and the right agree that that's improper. But what is enough to constitute coercion? The issue in the Kennedy case was, do you think that this coach praying at the 50-yard line right after the game uh, in full view is going to coerce his players to join him? And the court said, kind of by the way it read the record and narrowly focused at what particular games were at issue, they essentially said it's not going to affect the players. They're over singing the fight song with the band in the 3 games that are relevant to the record, which is, I mean, maybe for 3 games they were, but eventually, if you think there's a dynamic of wanting to please the coach and get more time, playing time, and maybe this coach is, going to help you get recruited for a college scholarship, etc. This is all the real ways in which the coach has impact and can pressure players' behavior. Eventually, they're going to maybe drift away from the band and the fight song and back over with the coach, and maybe they're doing that for their own, because they are students of faith, great. But we don't know, and we got the worry. So a second question is, even if coercion is the standard, is this court taking coercion seriously enough? I think it should. It should take coercion seriously when it's done to religious people, and I don't think the left does that and takes that seriously enough. But it should also, the court should also take coercion seriously when it could be imposed, when religion could be imposed on somebody.
It's almost like I want to ask Justice Thomas, like, does he think Harlan Crow's gifts are coercing him, like in any mean whatsoever?
Yeah, well, it's right. We're complicated beings. We have our views, and
Yes,
so we're not just completely driven by others, but they can affect us. So we're
absolutely.
complicated beings.
That line of coercion is so important. Like you're saying, how do we define it? Like, how do we define harm? How do we define these things that are kind of inherently vague, inherently up for interpretation? And I had this, I was listening to this book on how the idea of God changes your brain. It's a pretty prominent neuropsychologist and neuroscientist, and they are writing it, and they talked about how religion in general has a very positive effect on people. It helps their brain. It grows, like thinking about God can grow in your sense of connection to the world and your connection to the other and your connection, to other people, and compassion and empathy and all. I mean, they're just across the board, low, like blood pressure lowered, stress lowered, all this stuff for people who are praying and things like that. But one line he said is like, that is the case, but there is an exception, and it's when God is seen as harmful, judgmental, vindictive, something like that, right? This judgmental, angry, hostile God. And some of the studies and research suggest hurt and psychological harm, and also even over time, right? Permanent psychological harm, this kind of idea. And he made this comment that shocked me when he was doing the book. And he said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but when you, like the Surgeon General when you look at the Surgeon General warnings on cigarettes, it says, don't buy these cigarettes, essentially, because they can kill you. He's like, I wish the Surgeon General could give a warning on, put out a warning in a statement on religion, or like a warning on certain types of religion. And I thought about that, and it blew my mind, because I'm like, wait, you want the Surgeon General to say that certain types of belief are harmful for your health and the way people worship? And I wanted to get your sense on that, because so what I kind of sense going on is, as long as you're talking about a God that has no expectations on you or other people, maybe that could be harmful. Someone could say, I don't like that expectation. That harms me. That triggers me. That, whatever it is, the word that you want to use. How do we sort this out when you have certain kinds of religions that people will find repulsive in our current culture, and yet other people, it's a genuine belief, and we don't make it illegal for people to smoke cigarettes, even though there's a Surgeon General warning on it. But what do you think about that idea?
Yeah. So, right. I mean, the task of government over and over again is to decide when to uh, step in and restrict behavior because it's harmful in some way. I mean, harmful to you or harmful
Right.
to others. And that can include, there's a balance there of a lot of things. How bad is the harm? How certain is the harm? And then what kind of interests are there on the other side, like smoking, or whatever enjoyment people get from smoking, and so on, and then religion or other beliefs that people have. What interests are there in those beliefs? And then, do we think that government regulation is actually going to work? Prohibiting smoking, period, would probably like unleash another 1920s period, like prohibition of
Definitely.
alcohol, right? And same thing with, you could say this with marijuana as well. The war on drugs in some ways, in major ways, has been a failure, because you're trying to go after things and not taking account of the costs of enforcement on people and so on. With religion, we constitutionalized after a long history and a full consideration and debate, and seeing this as a recurring problem in society, that it just doesn't work for the government to step in and restrict religions because their ideas are bad or their tendencies are bad. You can step in when it leads to harmful conduct, but you can't do it just on the basis that it might lead to harmful conduct. And there, the reason is, a lot of it is history. It just failed over and over again. Restricting one side led to them trying to fight and retaliate and anticipate. We've got to kill you because you're obviously going to kill us. And that's the cycle of violence that the First Amendment was responding to, and I think is still a relevant kind of thing today. So I don't think we can do that. We have to draw lines about where religion, what the proper limits are. I keep saying that you can't harm others with your religious practice, and at one level that's the obvious answer. The problem is that what's a harm has gotten much, or what is defined as a harm has gotten potentially much broader in the modern world and the modern state. Because we regulate so many things. We're in a complex society. People are always interacting. They're bashing up against each other. And so government has to be able to legislate and so on. So anti-discrimination laws, for example, have grown dramatically in the last 30 years. If we let the government, the fact that the government says there's a harm here be the end of the inquiry, then we have a very serious, constriction of religious freedom. So I think that there are ways to sort of identify the key aspects of harm that ought to limit religious freedom, but just saying it's a harm isn't enough, because lots of things can be and are called harms by the government.
Yeah, so this is this will be my last question, but and we've already kind of addressed it a little bit early on, but I'd like for you to maybe do a little deeper dive about the connection between same-sex couples and religious conservative objectors. I know that you mentioned it in a couple chapters in your book, so I'd like for you to maybe just kind of unpack that and tell us what that connection is.
Right. So, again, I'd say it's this analogy between that we're talking in both cases about an identity that's pervasive to the person, that is not just an identity, but it's also lived out in conduct, whether that's following God's commandments in your life as you understand them, acting, right? It's free exercise of religion, not just free belief, right? It's free exercise of religion. And then same-sex couples living out their love, their attraction, their the same desire for relationship and commitment that opposite sex couples have. But it's not just the identity, it's lived out in action. And then it's lived out in public. Both sides claim that. So I again, those are kind of features of the two claims that I think should lead us to say, well, if you dismiss one of these claims and support the other, you might be making some inconsistent arguments. You might be missing something that the other side is saying. And if we can look at the analogy, I think we can at least maybe develop a little more sympathy. Throughout the book, I'm trying to tell people on both sides, and to tell myself too. I'm no genius on all of this, but think about the argument that you're making here. What would it mean for your side? So an easy one is conservative Christians who attack Islam, as let's say Pat Robertson, who over and over again said Islam is not a religion. Islam is a political movement that's designed to destroy you and take over the country. Okay. Here's the irony. That's exactly a thing that's said about the religious right. This is not real Christian faith. These people are just motivated politically. And look, some political activists, Christian activists, are motivated politically, and some Islamists are political. They do want to take over. They're terrorists, etc. But the vast majority of people who are trying to sort of assert their freedom just want to be able to live out their faith in society and not be imposed upon. And if you assert that for yourself as a conservative Christian, you need to assert it. You need to protect it for Muslims as well. I think the same thing. It's a little more complicated with same-sex couples and religious conservatives, but I think if you say, you know what, gay and lesbian couples, they need to be able to live out in public their relationships and not be in the closet. But you religious folk, keep that in your church. Don't bring that out into society. There's some inconsistency there, but it works the other way too.
Totally.
So I have a line, which is a line in the book is reciprocity works the other way too. And then I'm like, okay, that sounds like a Yogi Berra line. So I dropped a footnote saying, with apologies to Yogi Berra. That's what reciprocity is. It works both ways. So reciprocity works the other way too.
That's awesome. Well, man, Tom, thank you so much for being on the program. This has been a fascinating conversation. Your book is Religious Liberty in a Polarized Age. Will, could you hold it up again so everyone can see it. We want everyone to go buy it wherever books are sold. And I have my copy, Will has his. We encourage everyone to get one. How can people keep up with your work, Tom, and what you're putting out?
I'm on Twitter at TCBergMN. There are enough TC Bergs in the world that I had to put my state. I'm not a regular tweeter, but I'm there from time to time, and I'm on a blog called Mirror of Justice, which is a collection of law professors, mostly Catholic. I'm sort of the honorary non-Catholic observer on the blog.
Nice.
And we post about various these kinds of issues. So that's a couple places to find me.
That's great. Well, thanks everyone for watching and listening. This has been Thomas C. Berg. We want you to get his new book, and you can check out all of the things he said with his blog and Twitter as you can. Thanks so much for joining us. This has been Josh Bertram and Will Wright, your faithful host. Your political host. And until next time, don't keep your conversations left or right, but up. All right, guys. See you next time.
Thank you.
Take care.